Disciple of Christ podcast. I am outnumbered today, and I have been made fun of for my lack of decorations. Whitney or Michelle, what is going on, and what am I lacking?
Nothing. It's just the Relief Society compared to the Elders Quorum.
If men are that they might have joy.
Look at those decorations. They're dressed up nicer. But I did hear that neither of you are color coordinated today. I guess that's happened a time or two.
It has. We always get the mojo on what colors to wear.
This is intended to be a response to many of the things that have been said on Ward Radio, conversations with Don Bradley. One episode in particular, but there's other clips we'll be pulling up. Whitney, will you give us a brief introduction and why you might be relevant to this discussion?
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate you inviting me to be on your show. A few years ago, about 4.5 now, wrote a book titled Joseph Smith Revealed, A Faithful Telling. And in that book, it's my journey, partially my journey on coming to understand what God thinks about polygamy, and then what Joseph Smith taught about polygamy and what he did and did not do. And I'm assuming the reason I'm relevant to you today, as we're discussing Don Bradley's episodes with Ward Radio, is because he has mentioned me a few times.
So one of the big proponents of skepticism that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, Whitney Horning.
Wonderful. Michelle, please give us an introduction. And you were nice enough to hold up Whitney's book. It's like tag team already.
I hope I didn't distract, but everyone that doesn't have this book yet should. Okay. My name is Michelle Stone. I have a podcast called 132 Problems. Don has in the past mentioned me by name. In this episode, he talked about me, but without mentioning me by name. So we were a little bit amused why Whitney's name can be said, but apparently I am she who must not be named. I'm not sure of why that is. But anyway, this is a great topic. And I do want to say from the outset that Don actually is coming on my show. And I have a little bit of background to give about this most recent clip that was shared, this most recent interview on Ward Radio. So I want to be, while I think it's important that we respond to the things that were said in this episode, I do want to cut Don a little bit of slack that I think he's a stand-up guy trying his best, who actually knows this wasn't a great episode. So that's good. There's hope.
Whitney and Michelle, it's awesome having you. Before we dig into this, my job is going to be tyrannical traffic cop duties. We've got a lot of material that we want to cover, and I'm going to make sure, bam, we keep moving along. But first, we do need to thank the sponsor of today's episode. So we would like to tell everybody to make sure to be a patron of sponsor for today's show, Brigham's Brew root beer. Now, some people did express concern knowing that Brigham's Brew contains pure cane sugar, so there is a lighter version for those concerned about that in the cream soda. So that's one of our sponsors. And our other sponsor for today's show is The Great Apostameme, which you can join via Facebook. It is a private group, but the memes are among the greatest. Join the Mormon meme war, and it's happening at The Great Apostameme. So just to set the stage, here on Ward Radio, Don Bradley has been on a number of times. Carden is quite impressed with him, but Carden's going to kind of set the scene of what he wants to accomplish in this discussion.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to Ward Radio. I'm your host, Cardinal Ellis. I'm joined in the studio by Kwaku L. Brad Whitbeck and Don Juan Bradley, the prodigal prophet of polygamy, the liturgical librarian of all likelihood and likeness, and I botched it. Anyway, we got to talk about a really cool topic today, which is whether or not Joseph Smith actually practiced polygamy. Now, why is that a hot topic that would require one of the #1 scholars in Mormonism to talk about? Well, it's because there's a new movement in town. There's a new spiritual sheriff in town, and a lot of people are following this sheriff. Like a Pied Piper, he offers you two.
There's a new sheriff in town. Now, I do have to say, I didn't realize there was anybody digging into this topic of polygamy in my life. Here's the two different things that Carden says the spiritual sheriff is trying to accomplish.
Beautiful things. One, to liberate yourself of the burden of polygamy, which is seen still as an oddity by your society around.
Okay, I'll start on the bottom and go up. Michelle, did you want to be liberated from the idea that the church in which you were raised practiced polygamy?
So, as anyone who has watched even my very first short introductory episode will know, I was a very converted granddaughter of proud Mormon polygamists who I am on record with a lecture that I used to give often that has thousands of views on YouTube, saying that my sincere belief was that in order to become a Zion people, we had to be prepared to live the law of consecration and polygamy. That's what I thought Zion was. That's what I thought the celestial kingdom was. I know now that I was remarkably naive, but in my naive state, I thought it was a beautiful way to prove our dedication to the Lord. And from the beautiful stories handed down from my grandparents, that I now know the rest of those stories, but the very whitewashed, beautiful stories handed down, I thought there are simply things that we don't understand. And I was a overwhelmed, overworked mom of many children. I don't want to say that in a negative way. It's hard to raise a large family. I was tired. I loved it, but I was tired. And the thought of having some help was wonderful. So in my naive little mind, a plural wife basically meant a personal maid for me, which is disgusting. That was my perspective, and I'm on very public record.
But it could be said in a better manner to where it's like just more family infrastructure.
The idea that women need women, and that you would have someone to talk to while you're doing everything all day, and you would have someone to help with the children, and someone to help with the cooking, and someone to help with the cleaning. It's a beautiful myth.
Whitney, were you among those that Cardin Ellis references to where you didn't like dealing with the subject of polygamy attached to your religion? This is why you got into this topic.
Like Michelle, starting from the young age, I was very faithful. I grew up knowing the stories of my polygamist ancestors. I was proud of my heritage. It really wasn't until I got married and started really considering the little details of how it works and what it would do to our family, what it would do to our marriage. And then it just grew over time. The more I heard stories of polygamy, the more I just felt like it didn't make sense to me. And so for me, I started off being a faithful believer and then worked my way to where I am today.
For
Whitney
me,
was less naive than I was.
she kind of contemplated the implications a little bit more.
Yeah.
For me, it was about 2015-ish. I was specifically praying, Heavenly Father, how do I help my friends that have lost their testimonies? Because I knew it was the uncomfortable church history that was probably the biggest stumbling block for them. Bam, let's jump into Mormon stories. And the episodes that I found most beneficial were the ones that are discussing the uncomfortable Mormon history, which more often than probably any other individual topic was the behavior of Joseph Smith as president of the church associated with the claims of polygamy. And what I would listen to over and over again, what seemed like wild claims that I thought I already knew about. I thought I knew my church history because I've been going to seminary, and I've been a seminary teacher for a couple of years in California, as well as an institute attendee all the time. Just like, just give me my letterman, I'm master scriptorian. I thought I knew the history of the church. And every single time there would be outrageous claims of Joseph Smith and teenage girls and married women. Somebody like Brian C. Hales or another LDS fair apologist, somebody on the LDS faithful apologetic side would do an interview on Mormon Stories to follow up, which pretty much says, yes, that's technically true, but you're looking at it in too negative of a light every single time, with only one exception that I can even think of, to where anything was actually rebutted. It was just always, yes, it's true, but it's not as bad as you're saying. And my dive, when I started with the foregone conclusion that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and I just need to understand it better, it got dark and darker, and it kept going exclusively in that direction. I pushed all the way through it. I came to the conclusion maybe Joseph Smith was a reluctant polygamist. Heavenly Father, I'm sure there's more that I'm going to figure out later. And as I just kept serving faithful in the church, multiple callings at any given time, the light came back into my life, and I would be the guy that people called upon when there's tough questions from an investigator who's looking up stuff on the internet. Call up Brother Isbell. So, yeah, I was not shy about it. If anybody asked about polygamy, yep, it's an eternal principle. It'll be practiced in the heavens.
one interesting thing from what you were saying is that the way they explain away what Joseph was doing is saying, but God told him to. So it's not Joseph's fault, it's God's fault, right? And that's where this really gets problematic. The Mormon apologetics actually, in their need to defend Joseph, implicate God in a way that makes God an unbearable figure for non-naive women and men who are willing to study the actual history. Because I think that's the weakest side of all is, yes, Joseph did all of these things, but it's okay because God wanted him to. That's where we get into the most problems. And that's where people just reject God entirely, because if that's who God is, he's not good. He's not real. He's not consistent, and he's not reliable or trustworthy.
That's really where my journey started. I wanted to figure out God because I'd read the scriptures. I love the scriptures. I've always loved them. And I would read about, no respecter of persons. We're all equal before God. And then I would think about polygamy, and that just didn't mesh to me. And so I started questioning God and his character and how he could love his daughters. And that's really what began my journey. Is I wanted to figure out my place with God and what I really meant to him as a daughter.
My journey, when I learned in the scriptures that polygamy was not of God, it rocked me. I'd already gone through a lot of faith questions and transitions. This one rocked me because it was so foundational to my beliefs. So I spent years in the research and in the study and came to know certainly that polygamy was not of God. Joseph was still a wild card. I had no idea, but that wasn't the important question to me. The important question was about God. So for them to want to say that we're starting with the end in mind is absolutely, completely opposite of the truth. It took me a long time to get to either conclusion, and they came purely through research and evidence.
All right, so that's claim number one from Cardin, that there's a new spiritual sheriff in town, and he wants to relieve you from having to put up with the burden of polygamy in the church. What's the other one, Cardin?
And also it relieves you of a kind of burden of basically juxtaposing American conservatism with some of the modern geopolitical moves of the church, primarily Russell M. Nelson telling members of the church to go get the jibby jabby. Okay, that didn't square very well with people. And I understand that he didn't tell us to go get it, but that's the way.
Okay. Is anybody willing to say that is factually true? President Nelson did not tell the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to get the vaccination. Anybody willing to say that's a true statement?
I think that they say a lot of things carefully. And I think that he said that it's a literal miracle from God. It's the miracle we were fasting and praying for. It's a gift, and and we're supposed to do what the prophet does. And it was very visibly the prophet's self-proclaimed way of being a good global citizen. So I would say in every way possible, they told us to get it. But I still don't know what that has to do with polygamy, honestly. That's irrelevant.
He's trying to point out the two things. He knows that there's two reasons why members are leaving the church in droves. Now, for 10 plus years, it has been the John DeLynn crowd, which most commonly gets people to embrace some form of atheism and agnosticism. We appreciate the upbringing that we've had, but we're now more enlightened and we don't see God or the universe the same way anymore. Now, the other thing that's happening is now people who are
hi, little guy.
Oh, hi! He looks almost like a ghost.
He put on his green shirt,
floating head.
Green screen. You're distracting, Joseph. But so many people have had issues with the Mormon history, but now he is referring to faithful members of the church that are still bursting at the seams with faith in Jesus Christ and a determination to serve him to the end, who are no longer part of mainstream LDS. Now, in the ward area where I'm at in Ogden, which is one of the most densely populated places in Ogden, in all of Utah, There's 3 congregations that just got reduced down to 1 congregation. Where my buddy is at over in Salt Lake City, a densely populated residential area, it's an entire stake reduced down to only 1 congregation. And that's happening all over. So not only is the John DeLynn crowd of atheism and agnosticism continuing to reduce activity and membership in the church, there's now those who explode with faith in Jesus Christ, who recognize the voice of Jesus Christ saying, this doctrine is not from me. And like you guys, the question of, is it from God? That's the primary one. If we claim to be the church of Jesus Christ, in whatever sense you want to recognize that, if we're not asking, does this come from Jesus Christ? We're not even asking the right questions. I had a long form conversation with them a number of months ago. And what I would ask, is this policy of jibby jabby, is it from Jesus Christ? They act like they're allergic to discussing what comes from Jesus Christ and what doesn't. What about the policies of President Nelson? Is it from Jesus Christ, global lockdowns? Is it from Jesus Christ, mass mandates? Is it from Jesus Christ that President Nelson declares all churches will be shut down? Is that from Jesus Christ?
I would say I do not believe in prophetic infallibility.
So they might be polygamy hobbyists, but very little interest, very little indication of interest in discussing what comes from Jesus Christ, what doesn't.
I just have to really quickly, just because I'm in a unique spot, I have to say, I think it's a tragedy what's happening to the church. I think it's a tragedy what has been happening to the church for 10 years. And I know I have to also say that before these newer issues came up that made people struggle with church membership, before that, it was the very valid, painful LGBT issues with the very sad 2015 policy. So it's almost felt like an intentional desire to kind of break the church because so many people left during that decade. And then when you shut down the church and tell people all, oh, it doesn't really matter, you don't really have to go, it's really hard to get them to come back, especially when there are new objections piled on top of those old objections. So I think it's all of this coming together. I think people are struggling for very difficult and very valid reasons on every side of every question.
Very much so. And I'm glad that you pointed out, but because I don't want to give the impression that I have anything but absolute love for the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Okay, so I'm actually moving towards the end of the conversation in this episode because Don Bradley and the others he's discussing with really indicate what the primary concern is. It's not so much polygamy and its implications, and it's not so much the jibby jabby and the policies. Here's what it really is.
If people who are skeptical that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy come away from this still being just as skeptical that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, I'm fine with that. Like, I don't think it's the most important thing in the world or something. Right. I do think that it's unfortunate that maybe a lot of people, because they take that position, they end up then becoming alienated from the church because they think then that the church must have gone off track.
Which is the solid pattern I've seen in these people. Because I've been doing the same thing, Kwaku. Like, I've been listening to a lot of these people's podcasts and the writings that they have out there and looking into it. And over, I see that be the result, Well,
because the shadow lurking is, okay, he didn't practice polygamy. And then that means he was framed. Okay, well, then who framed him? Did Brigham Young frame him? If Brigham Young framed him, what else did he do? Did Brigham Young kill the prophet? Did Brigham Young lead us astray? Are we a Brighamite false church? That's kind of where it leads, right?
If Brigham's successor, John Taylor, continued the pattern of polygamy, and his successor, right down to Joseph Smith, Heber J. Grant, was a polygamist, right? The last polygamist prophet we had, and the current church president is a successor, ultimately, of Brigham Young. If Brigham Young's a false prophet, that puts us in trouble as a church, right? And so,
if Brigham Young is a false prophet, that puts us in trouble as a church. He sees it and he says it out loud. If Brigham Young is a false prophet, then we're in trouble as a church. So the church has abandoned all of the doctrinal innovations of Brigham Young. But on polygamy, it would be too easy for the members to realize on a fundamental doctrine taught for 30 years as a requirement for salvation and exaltation, Brigham Young was lying where that doctrine came from. Michelle, will you hit us with this?
Yeah, this is one I made for the Great Apostle meme. This is what I see happening, right? This exactly. They want people to accept this is who the Mormon God is. This is who the founding Mormon prophet is. And all of that is fine. Whitney and I just recorded an episode last night. This is our second day in a row getting to talk together. And we spent a long time watching a particular video, face to face with the youth, and watching the discomfort, watching an apostle punt to a female historian with uncomfortable laughter saying, why don't you take this one?
As you can imagine, we've received quite a few questions regarding polygamy. For example, a young adult from Utah asked, I've struggled for years to come to peace about polygamy in the early church. Why was it necessary for Joseph Smith and many other leaders to practice it? And Morgan from Florida added, what do I tell my family when they ask about polygamy in the early days of the church? They aren't generally satisfied with the, well, we don't practice it anymore answer.
Is it fair to ask you to answer this one, Kate?
That's a big question.
This is a terrible topic that no one wants to touch with a 10-foot pole. It is leading church members out of the church in droves and has been for decades. And they want to blame us. I'm sorry, but truth is the solution. And we're the ones digging out, doing the very difficult, time-consuming, but thrilling work of finding the truth about the founding of our church, about our scriptures, about who God is, who Joseph Smith was. And that is the answer. And another meme I just posted, well, here's what it is. You have to choose. You cannot have both Brigham Young and Joseph Smith be good. Your options are Joseph Smith was pretty awful, but it was God's fault. And Brigham was just doing what Joseph was doing. That's one option. And that's what I'd say they're going for. Or you can say, God's pretty awesome. Joseph was actually pretty awesome. Brigham got some things wrong, which we already know. We already have a list of what he did wrong. And frankly, we've already abandoned and rejected, and even President Hinckley condemned polygamy.
You condemn it? I condemn it, yes, as a practice, because I think it is not doctrinal, it is not legal, and this church takes the position that we will abide by the law.
So the only thing we have left to do is just go that one little more step that would not damage the church at all, because it's just in keeping with what we've already been doing for over 100 years. Just go that one little more step, and we could start saving church members. When people are tuning in to my podcast, I get so many messages of, finally, the Spirit overwhelms them with truth. Finally, things make sense. Finally, the scriptures fall into line. Finally, the Spirit is there, and they can trust God. It is a beautiful gospel that we have when it's not messed up with the corruptions and the false doctrines of man, which frankly is just more evidence of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, because it's exactly what the Book of Mormon would tell us would happen. We would have false traditions. We would have false ideas. We would have to let go of a lot of these things. We would have a house built on the sand that you have to let that shake up so you can be built on the rock of Christ, which you can't do when you are stuck in the false traditions of man, mainly polygamy.
It's scripture time. So in preparation for this, I say prayers pretty regularly. There's times when I've been known to simply pull over my car and just kneel down and pray because I feel something saying, do it. And I don't know the reasons why. This was one where I was in my car, not told to pull over, but it's like, Heavenly Father, what should I study in preparation for this? And it was the Sons of Messiah. What's the first chapter in the Book of Mormon that gets into the Sons of Messiah? It's Alma chapter 17. We're going to read verses 2, 3, and then verse 9. Okay, now these sons of Messiah, they were with Alma, the younger, at the time the angel first appeared unto him. Therefore, Alma did rejoice exceedingly to see his brethren. And what added more to Alma's joy is that they were still his brethren in the Lord. They didn't fall off the path because of listening to Mormon stories or Ward Radio. They were still his brethren in the Lord. Yea, and they had waxed strong in the knowledge of the truth. For they were men of sound understanding. What led to that? They had searched the scriptures diligently, that they might know the word of God. But this is not all. They had given themselves to much fasting, prayer. Therefore, they had the spirit of prophecy and the spirit of revelation. And when they taught with the power and authority of God. Okay, now, keep in mind, these sons of Messiah, they're preaching among the apostate people from this many generations back who are homicidal towards my people. And what is it that they had to teach a lost people that are convinced we're already right? And it came to pass that they, the sons of Messiah, journeyed many days in the wilderness and fasted much and prayed much, that the Lord would grant unto him a portion of his spirit to go with them and abide with them, that they might be an instrument in the hands of God to bring, if it were possible, their brethren, the Latter-day Saints, the Lamanites, to the knowledge of the truth, to the knowledge of the baseness of their traditions, of their fathers, which were not correct. Now, I think if I'm a young Mormon missionary, knock, 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 open your door, I have every expectation. You let me in, I'm going to help you abandon your Catholic false traditions. If you're trying to say to yourself that your sacrament with a wafer and the way that you do it, you're going to be convinced. You have to become convinced that it's wrong and know that this, well, we Latter-day Saints, we have to have that same level of humility to where when I started with the foregone conclusion that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, it was dark and ugly, got darker and uglier. When I opened up my heart and my mind, is it even possible? Is it even a possibility that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist? All of a sudden, the Spirit convinced me of the baseness of the traditions of my fathers, including my own personal father and his almost practice of polygamy. So, yeah, the baseness of the traditions, that's what we got to take on. So thanks for giving an extra plug for the Book of Mormon, Michelle.
And another interesting connection that was that came up in one of my recent podcasts is I think at times when we read scribes in the scriptures, in our day and age, we can replace that with historians. Being said, I love historians, but they give us this version of truth, this narrative. That's what Whitney and I just went in depth about. It's going to be released probably next week. And the next week, it'll be a two-parter. We had a lot to talk about. But the traditions, well, the scribes that are giving us the false doctrines, now for us are the historians that are giving us the historical narrative, telling us who Joseph Smith is and who God is. That's just not true.
Now, there's some parts that I'm going to skip over. I'm taking a look at the notes and the timestamps that we put inside of here. So Don Bradley goes on throughout the episode to say, I sympathize with them. I wish that Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist, as if it's like already firmly established. Now, people can watch that for themselves. Let's skip ahead to some of the claims that Don Bradley makes and see, is there room to believe something otherwise? You know what I'm about to pull up right now? A claim from a previous appearance of him on Ward Radio, where he claims that Joseph Smith was marrying these particular women.
So when you pictured Joseph Smith anticipating marrying his first Nauvoo wife, what I want to know is which of these did you picture? So go to the next slide, or maybe it's the one after that.
Rich, which one of these do you picture?
Which of these did you picture? In other words,
no.
How pregnant did you picture her when you pictured Joseph Smith choosing his first Nauvoo plural wife?
Not pregnant.
Because
not pregnant.
the correct image that you should have had is the third, I believe it's the third one from the right there, the 7 months pregnant. If you go to the next slide.
Okay.
Okay. So nobody pictures the woman very pregnant. Nobody. Okay. Yeah. And yet, this is Zina's son, born with her legal husband, Zebulon Jacobs, his headstone, right? That shows he was born on January 2nd, 1842. Zina marries Joseph on October 27th of 41. 2 months before the child is born, she is 7 months pregnant at the time of the marriage.
Oh, wow.
She was pregnant from her legal husband, getting close to giving birth, and then Joseph Smith marries her.
This is amazing that you are doing this math and then finding gravestones and then figuring out the dates can't match up. This is incredible.
You're like a detective. What the heck? Yeah.
So why did he marry her if she was married?
Is it evidence of Joseph Smith's polygamy that he might be marrying married women that are 8 months pregnant?
Well, again, the evidence for that is created later. And so there's actually no contemporary evidence while Joseph was alive to prove that he married women. But let's suppose that he did. Why? Why would he, if the commandment is to raise up a righteous seed, why would you marry a woman who's already pregnant and is already married? So I know the apologists make the statement that that was to appease Emma, right? So then it wasn't sexual. I know Richard Bushman has made the conclusion that Joseph didn't actually have intercourse with any of his wives. But it's absolutely ridiculous to me to think that because somebody years later claimed that Joseph had married them, and then when they did the math, the church did the math, they said, oh, well, that woman was pregnant during the date when she claimed she married Joseph. Therefore, he married pregnant women.
The challenge is it's hard to tell a good lie. So when you decades later are in Utah with this desperate need to prove your validity against the sons of Joseph, who have in many ways a better claim and are telling a more truthful story, and you need to get all of these women to claim, you're not thinking, oh, is that date viable? Could we make that work? It took us decades later to get in there and go, oh, that was a problem. Because you think if they said, hey, I married Joseph, I was 8 months pregnant at the time. That's an important part of the story. Also, can we point out, God gave a revelation with all of the instructions to govern how polygamy was supposed to work. And it very clearly requires virgins. I only know of one pregnant virgin in the history of the world, and it wasn't any of Joseph's wives.
Yeah, it wasn't even the same generation. But it makes me think, is it more reasonable to think this is evidence of Joseph Smith having extra wives, or is it more likely evidence to where this was made up after the fact? That is why it is so incongruent. And I would ask of Cardin Ellis, Cardin, if you believe that this is true, that Joseph Smith is marrying pregnant women, because your guest, the prophet of polygamy by your own words,
Don Juan Bradley, the prodigal prophet of polygamy.
Under what circumstances, Cardin, would you allow your 8-month pregnant wife to marry the religious leader of a church you don't even belong to? So get back to me on that one, Cardin.
I have to add one more thing to that, the fact that these claims were made in the first place, starting in 1869 and continuing into 1883, that shows the desperation for those people at that time to claim that Joseph was, to validate their practices by pinning it on Joseph. The fact that we today are continuing the claim that Joseph was marrying 8-month pregnant women shows our desperation to continue to do the same thing. We're caught. My mom wrote a great song that I've sung often that goes, when you tell one lie, it leads to another. So you tell 2 lies to cover each other. Then you tell 3 lies and, oh, brother, you're in trouble up to your ears. And that's where we are. It's lie upon lie upon lie in order to preserve the initial lie. I say, let's dig out and be willing to honestly look at the truth. If someone can show me a doctrinal reason instantiated in 132 anywhere that would in any way justify or command Joseph to marry pregnant women, then let's have that conversation. Until then, what are you talking about?
Absolutely. And Joseph constantly and consistently said that he never taught in private what he did in public. He taught stronger doctrines in public, and he was as obedient as he could be. So I have my entire life, before I came to these conclusions and did this research, D&C 132 was ridiculous to me, because you get to that whole part about marrying virgins, and I'm like, Joseph didn't, Brigham didn't, Heber didn't. So it's just preposterous.
I even think about in Doctrine and Covenants, where the Lord says that this generation will have the Lord's word through Joseph, not through people's recollections decades later, actually through Joseph. So when we don't have it through Joseph, we should recognize that's not the pattern the Lord said the Latter-day Saints would have.
And what we have universally through Joseph, Doctrine and Covenants 42, thou shalt cleave unto thy wife and to none else, right? We have it repeated. The Book of Mormon is the most anti-polygamy book of scripture that we have.
Thus saith the Lord, they understand not the scriptures, for they seek to excuse themselves in committing whoredoms, because of the things which were written concerning David and Solomon his son. David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord. For there shall not any man among you have, save it be one wife, and concubines ye shall have none.
Second place, most anti-polygamy book we have is the Doctrine and Covenants. So somebody explain that to me, because polygamous leaders don't preach against their doctrine. It is hard to be a polygamous leader because it's hard to get the women to stay in line. And all you have to do is look at Brigham's sermons, Orson's sermons, Heber's sermons, look Jedediah's sermons, and look at how they hammer on polygamy, hammer on the women, tell them to cease their incessant whining. God in Jacob 2 says the women's hearts were pierced with deep wounds, right? Mm-hmm. And God talks about the women's tears. God has infinite compassion for God's daughters, which is why we have the Book of Mormon, which is why they were condemned and told that they were more guilty than the Lamanites, who they looked down upon. The Lamanites loved their wives and lived monogamously. So we take all of the scriptures universally given by Joseph Smith, throw them out, ignore them with our spiritual blindness, with the scales of darkness on our eyes, in order to preserve this lie. It has to stop.
Yeah. Well, I can already hear Don Bradley's voice and the voice of others saying, well, we're just looking at the historical record. We're not saying that it's nice or that we like it. We're just saying what the historical record says. And I just want to ask,
scriptures are part of the historical record.
Yes.
I'm sorry. The scriptures are part of the historical record. They are Joseph's revelations. We can compare Brigham's and Heber's and Orson's and Jedediah's teachings to Joseph's. You cannot lead a polygamist organization while preaching against polygamy. You have to hammer on it all the time to keep women in their place. Joseph could not have done this.
Whitney, I saw something bubbling up with you.
Oh, just amen. It brings to mind Jacob 2, which, they like to say that's the caveat that God says, well, if I command it. So here, God's giving this beautiful sermon through his servant Jacob. Jacob says it, he doesn't want to do it. And basically he's compelled to. And he starts telling them about how, Solomon and David did wickedly and abominably and having many wives. It broke the hearts of the daughters in Jerusalem. Their cries ascend up to the Lord. The Lord loves chastity. One man has one wife, no concubines. Oh, but if I want to make my daughters cry, I might. Oh, if I want to break
I need more
heart,
babies,
I might.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
if I need more babies, I don't care about my daughters.
Right. And it makes God just completely changing. And he says, I do not change. If I change, I'm not God. I do not lie. If I lie, I'm not God. Jacob clearly says that those commandments are given to raise up a righteous branch, meaning the people he's talking to. He's trying to get them to be more righteous. So he's giving them the commandment, one wife and one wife only.
Yeah.
And there's nails on a chalkboard when people say this isn't about theology. I think Don Bradley says that. It's just about facts. Well, I love what Michelle says. The scriptures are a historical record. They are fact, and they teach unequivocally no polygamy.
Yeah.
And they're a historical record I have to say one more thing. They're a historical record of what Joseph believed, what Joseph taught. Yeah. Whether you think they were inspired or that they were from Joseph, it doesn't matter. They're Joseph's. They're either God's words coming through Joseph's or Joseph's words. And they are strictly monogamous. And can I point out that while we're trying to say, oh, if I need a lot of babies born, I no longer care about my daughters, which is ludicrous. You cannot separate Jacob 2:30 from Jacob 2:31. Read it in context, please. And continuing on to the end of the chapter. But beyond that, every single time God started a new covenant people with the commandment to multiply and replenish, it was in monogamy. Adam and Eve, Noah and Noah's wife, Sariah and Lehi. We can go on and on and on. And we can include Joseph and Emma.
Yeah, and I believe that it is completely reasonable to expect men of God to be strong on this issue. I see too many weak mouses who are saying, we're just looking at this set of facts. No, men of God do not hide from God. They don't try to put themselves up. I'm a faithful monogamist while marrying other married women and teenage girls. Just the kind of despicable hypocrites that Don Bradley and Brian C. Hales have to turn Joseph Smith into. I have little to no patience for it. I know it comes across strong that just saying that it is just spiritually weak, spiritually impotent. There's no power behind it. And it should be no surprise why people leave the church in droves when that is the false version of Joseph Smith being promoted by these men.
I mean, just read verse 32 right there. I mean, how can you read that? If you're a man with any compassion at all, who loves his wife with all of his heart, how can you read that and believe what the LDS Church has turned this into? This is their polygamy loophole. And then you get to verse 32. You know, the cries of the fair daughters of this people shall come up unto me against the men of my people. So these are already the Lord's people, and he's trying to course correct them. They're starting to dabble into something that is going to cause them not to be his people and is going to cause suffering and heartache and sorrow. There's just no way you can read this whole entire chapter and pull out of there that the Lord's going to do a little 180 and say, just kidding. Yeah. I need that select man and that chosen man and this guy over here to do polygamy.
Well, which again, this is how God treats the suffering of women. Brigham repeatedly calls it incessant whining and complaining. I will not be surrounded by complainers, right? I don't need my wives in heaven. What does Heber C. Kimball say? God will give me new wives if you won't follow me, right? The women's pain does not matter to polygamists. We also should point out an important part of this discussion is let's talk about the polygamists in the Book of Mormon just really briefly, and let's see which prophet they are more similar to. We have a pattern. King Noah, Riplikish, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, Brigham Young. Look at the similarities between those types, and then put Joseph Smith in with them, and you have to think one of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong because those similarities do not hold true with Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
I think about the God that is speaking to Jacob, who's a high priest after the holy order of God, who's the one speaking in Jacob chapter 2. The God speaking to Jacob condemns the actions of David and Solomon. But whatever God is speaking in Doctrine and Covenants section 132 says that it is his principle and doctrine of many wives and concubines. It's quite evident that if Don Bradley, Brian C. Hales, and others are promoting the God of Doctrine and Covenants section 132, it is a different God than is speaking in the Book of Mormon.
100%.
All right, so let's see what Don says about polygamy in the eternities.
And so people think, again, that Joseph Smith practicing polygamy means we have to practice polygamy for eternity. I don't see why that's the case. Why couldn't Joseph Smith have practiced polygamy for reasons that were specific to his life or his time? Or one might think it was a mistake, right? But in either case, that doesn't mean that we're all going to be condemned somehow to living polygamy forever because Joseph Smith did it. That's not how eternity works.
Okay, so let me throw this over to you, Whitney. Is that consistent with the teachings of the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Polygamy is not going to be required of anybody in the eternities.
Well, so the word required maybe is something we could debate. But I know growing up, I mean, since I was a little girl, I knew that, you know, there was this idea that there's going to be more righteous women than men in the celestial kingdom. And so men would be required, I guess you could say that, to marry those women so they could have a spouse because, you know, in the highest heavens, according to LDS doctrine, you must be married. And so I grew up thinking it was a requirement for a man who was righteous enough, right? So not a requirement for everyone. But then again, now we get into the elitism that if you're righteous enough and get chosen to have more wives, you will. I grew up thinking it was required. And the temple itself, until just a few years ago, men whose spouses died or could get remarried in the temple for time and eternity. I had a guy in my ward who would, when Vern and I were first married, that would stand up and talk about how he was a polygamist because 3 of his wives had already died and he was on wife number 4.
He was
and in his obituary, the children wrote, he is now with all of his wives.
That's disgusting. So here are a couple of my quick thoughts. Oh, sorry. Am I going too fast?
Good. I love it.
I love it.
I have a lot to say. So first of all, didn't we just hear a clip of Don Bradley telling us this is not a theological issue?
Then we're not looking at like theology so much as we're looking at historical evidence.
not only is it a theological issue, but Don Bradley is authorized to tell us how eternity works.
That doesn't mean that we're all going to be condemned somehow to living polygamy forever because Joseph Smith did it. That's not how eternity works.
No explanation for it. Just I'm now going to tell you that's not how eternity works. Oh, based on what?
Based upon
Don,
what?
and is this a theological question or not?
That's not how eternity works.
I do want to acknowledge that Don did ask that he didn't want this episode aired until he had come on my podcast, but he had to postpone a couple of times, so it aired in the interim. So I don't want to be too hard on him, because I think he acknowledges that there are issues with some of the things he said, and I really appreciate that he's willing to come on and talk to me. But I do want to say that trouble of it not being a theological issue, but then it being a theological issue, and he's qualified to speak on eternity, those are already problems. Then he mentions many times throughout this episode about how all the pieces fit together like a puzzle piece, and you can't just take a piece here and a piece there out of context, but you have to fit them all together. I cannot believe how either completely ignorant or dishonest both Don Bradley and Brian Hales on my podcast are about the teachings of the early polygamists. It was said repeatedly in no uncertain terms that polygamy was absolutely necessary for exaltation. It wasn't only necessary, it was the actual means of exaltation. The man literally, well, I guess his wives gave birth to his kingdom that would glorify and honor him, right? You impregnated your way to godhood. That was literally how it worked, and they repeatedly said it. They said that if the church ever abandoned polygamy, it would be in apostasy. That's why it was such a big issue when they finally did. And so I can give you one example if you need it, but I think most of us know all of the many quotes about how polygamy was absolutely necessary for exaltation. So I find it interesting that we still keep polygamy while rejecting everything that the polygamists said about polygamy.
And I recognize that they will not point to what the early leaders say. Right now, I'm going to pull up on my screen. This is the 1886 revelation from John Taylor. I'm going to show it up on the screen because it's too small for people to read along with me. But they had already changed the everlasting covenant from giving God your broken heart and contrite spirit to polygamy. So when that term, new and everlasting covenant, is used here, it's referring to polygamy. John Taylor writes down the following in the voice of the Lord. My son John, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant, how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord, all commandments that I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. How can I revoke an everlasting covenant? For I am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants cannot be abrogated nor done away with, but they stand forever. Have I given my word in great plainness on this subject? Yet have not great numbers of my people been negligent in the observance of my law and keeping of my commandments? And yet have I borne with them these many years, and this because of their weakness, because of the perilous times, and furthermore, it is pleasing to me that men should use their free agency in regard to these matters. Nevertheless, I, the Lord, do not change my word, and my covenants and my law do not. And as I have heretofore said by my servant Joseph, all those who would enter into my glory must and shall obey my law. And I have not commanded men that if they were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, they must do the works of Abraham. I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting, and those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof. Amen. Now, this is the president of the church giving a revelation in the voice of the Lord as if it is authoritative from God. If the God speaking to John Taylor is binding upon the Latter-day Saints, did they have authority to do away with polygamy?
This is so interesting to read this right now because Whitney and I just did a big episode on Saints, which is the authoritative book, and the Gospel Topics essays, which are authoritative. And now the new teaching is that monogamy is the rule and polygamy is the rare exception. How does that jive with John Taylor's teachings? I have another quote. If you are interested in sharing my screen, you can. Yes. And I'll let you go ahead and read this one as well. You read them very well.
Voice, I'm feeling it.
This is Brigham Young.
We wish to obtain all the father Abraham obtained. I wish here to say the elders of Israel and to all the members of his church and kingdom that it is in the hearts of many of them to wish that the doctrine of polygamy was not taught and practiced by us. It is the word of the Lord. I wish to say to you and all the world that if you desire with all your hearts to obtain the blessings which Abraham obtained, you will be polygamous, at least in your faith, or you will come short of enjoying the salvation and glory which Abraham has obtained. This is as true as God lives. You wish that there were no such thing in existence. If you have in your hearts to say, he will pass along in the church without obeying or submitting to it in our faith or believing this order, because for aught that we know, this community may be broken up, yet we may have lucrative offices offered to us. We will not, therefore, be polygamous, lest we should fail in obtaining some earthly honor, character, and office, etc. The man that has in his heart and will continue to persist in pursuing that policy will come short of dwelling in the presence of the Father and the Son in celestial glory. The only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. Others attain unto this glory. Yeah, I'll stop right there. But yeah, this is unmistakable. Brigham Young and what I just read from John Taylor, the God speaking to these men says polygamy is a requirement in the eternities. You can't obtain salvation without it.
And this is a small sampling of an entire anthology of this unmistakable, clear teaching. It's repeated for all of those decades.
Yeah, 3 consecutive decades. And they want to pretend like, were these men speaking the doctrine of Jesus Christ or not? It becomes obvious when they lose their confidence to simply teach what the presidents of the church teach. It means they know that they're on shaky ground and not built on the rock of Christ. All right, let's see what else Don has to say regarding the records regarding polygamy.
Okay, so this is talking to Emma Smith, right?
Okay.
So it addresses her by name. Okay, so actually let's do verse 57. That's the one I was thinking of.
Okay, cool. We'll do verse 57. Here it goes. And again, I say let not my servant Joseph put his property out of his hands, lest any enemy come and destroy him, for Satan seeketh to destroy. For I am the Lord thy God, and he is my servant. And behold, and lo, I am with him, and as I was with Abraham thy father, even unto his exaltation and glory. Right there.
Okay. So it's saying in the context of these things that it had just been instructing Emma, it adds that Joseph is not supposed to put his property out of his hands. Okay, so in William Clayton's journal, under this exact date, he talks about the revelation that Joseph dictates. He says that it's read to Emma, that Emma does not believe it. Joseph and Emma have an argument about this, and that then Joseph calls Clayton into the room to witness an agreement that Joseph and Emma make with each other, and that Joseph and Emma are both crying as they make this agreement, right? And then afterward, Joseph instructs Clayton to deed most of his lots that he owns, his real estate in the city of Nauvoo, to Emma, and his half interest in the steamboat, the Maid of Iowa. So this revelation is saying, Joseph, don't get rid of your property. Don't put your property out of your hands. Joseph and Emma, according to Clayton's journal for that day, are making an agreement. It looks like a separation agreement. Emma wants to make sure that she's going to have property if they split up, right? So Joseph instructs Clayton to deed this property to Emma. Well, the things we have the deed.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. We have the deed. Okay. It is dated.
Let me ask you, Michelle. So Don Bradley's making the claim that William Clayton has recorded in his journal deeds being put into Emma's hands that are consistent with details that we know of from Section 132. This is pretty solid evidence, isn't it? That the details regarding that revelation, Section 132, were being kept contemporaneously. That's why the details of William Clayton's journals match up with details in Section 132.
So Whitney and I just had an in-depth conversation about this that will be released shortly. But if you want to go ahead and share my screen, there are actually several issues in this clip that we could discuss. First of all, we don't have William Clayton's journal, But we do have the same thing that Don Bradley has, which is the transcript that Andrew Ehat made from William Clayton's journal. And this is exactly what it says on the day in question, July 12th, 1843. And this is all that it says. So I invite people to read what it actually says compared to what Don Bradley, the foremost expert on sources about polygamy, claims that it says. Where does it talk about them crying together, the separation agreement? Also, if you put it in context with the day, everything that was supposed to have happened this day, it does not work. I go into that in depth. But, there are other things to say. Whitney, do you want to talk about putting the property piece, and then I'll go to the deeds?
Well, we found a sermon where Joseph Smith is instructing the people to get their land deeded to them, to get it properly deeded so that no one can take it away from them. So that's one thing he was doing. And then he was also charging people. So in Emma's deed, this smoking gun, as they like to call it, he charged his own wife $10,000 for her land. So, it's just much ado about nothing, in my opinion.
Well, and there's much more. So Doctrine and Covenants, he says that it matches together with this because Doctrine and Covenants tells Joseph, 132, it's the fraudulent revelation tells Joseph not to put his property out of his hand. So the fact that he proceeds the very next thing, the same day, to put all of his property out of his hand proves that it's valid and that it was happening that day because Joseph was given a clear direction from the Lord and he immediately disobeys it. Therefore, that's proof that it's valid. I do not understand Don's reasoning on that. If someone can help me understand it, I'd welcome it. But let me go ahead and share another thing. All right, so there are so many things to this. This one claim here, I just want to clarify this historical reverence that we have for the historians is ill-placed because we have, like, those of us who are the underdogs, who are taking the minority position, are forced to be extremely careful and extremely thorough, whereas the others can just kind of throw stuff out there because it's not going to be questioned as intensely as we are going to be, right? So this is actually a huge thing that Whitney and I go into a bit, and I'm going to be doing an entire episode in the forthcoming weeks on lots, on deeds and lots, because it's an important part of this that they claim proves Joseph's polygamy, and it does the exact opposite. This is indeed the deed to Emma Smith on July 12, 1843. If you look at it, it's hundreds of lots listed. This would have taken hours and hours to prepare. It's in William Clayton's handwriting. So yep, he knew about the deed. He writes in his journal, which we have shown is a later production. It's a fair copy. It's not, it's just like calling the women Joseph's wives' journals to imply that they wrote them at the time. They're later reminiscences. This is a later edited preparation, but this is the important part right here. Let me go to the next one. This is Hiram's deed that they included on the Joseph Smith's papers, but it's not connected to anything. And clearly, by the direction of God, I found this. If you look, this is deed to Hiram Smith, 12th July, 1843. It is identical to Emma's deed in that it is written the same day by William Clayton in William Clayton's handwriting, $10,000, hundreds of lots. This is massive. If people don't understand the full implications of this, well, I hope they'll watch my episode on deeds anyway. But what this proves right here is that the deed to Emma, and thus any deeds, have absolutely nothing to do with Joseph's polygamy. There's so much more information I have to bring in about this. The fact that Joseph was actually being investigated and advised at this point over his finances. There was an agent in town watching over his shoulder. He was not free to give all of his property to his estranged wife. Plus, show me any husband who, when his wife says, hey, I want a divorce, says, oh, here's all of my property, plus all of the property of the church I'm in charge of, plus all of the property of the city I'm in charge of. There, honey, now divorce me, right? It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous claim. But this deed by Hiram, filled out on the same day by William Clayton, and then hidden. It is not included in the trustee's book of land deeds that William Clayton was charged with compiling. Emma's is. And then Emma's was written later into the narrative. Are you getting what a big deal this is?
It makes one really consider why the church has not released William Clayton's journals yet.
And I'm thrilled that they did include this in the Joseph Smith papers. Whitney and I both realized we better hurry and download it and take screenshots because some of Hiram's materials have a way of magically disappearing repeatedly by church historians. But this one slipped through the cracks and it hasn't been disappeared yet.
Okay.
And it's a big deal.
Michelle, let me go ahead and play this one right here. Don Bradley says that it is evidence of the veracity of Section 132, the fact that the revelation itself calls Joseph out for his transgressions, and Brigham Young would never put up with that. Let's listen to what Don says on that.
That Joseph Smith did not, basically, he didn't believe Joseph Smith, they kind of ever did anything wrong. He thinks that you have to believe... He says, like, basically, Joseph Smith did everything right. Anyone else who says otherwise, the 12, we do not give them the hand, fellowship with them.
My man. Hey. You know, so, Joseph Smith did nothing wrong.
Right?
He was hashtagging it before it was a hashtag. Right.
And Brigham's especially thinking this with regard to polygamy.
Okay. So we'll just end it right there. In other words, Don claims Brigham Young would never tolerate anyone insinuating that Joseph did something wrong. Does that hold true with what we know of Brigham's public statements and publications?
There are actually a couple of other things in the longer quote of what he said, because he said that Brigham Young, and he reads in section 132, verses 50 and 56, and somewhere else where it accuses Joseph of sin and transgression and tells Emma that if she will forgive Joseph, then God will forgive her. And he claims that Brigham hated Joseph. He would never say that to Emma. He would never, say something. And what he's failing to realize, again, look at the context of when this was written. This was written in the time of polygamy when men were teaching their women, if you will forgive me, God will forgive you. Right? It was setting up that doctrine very intentionally, which is a disgusting, manipulative doctrine. Right? God will only forgive you if you forgive me. And they say again and again how you can't ever criticize your husband of doing anything wrong, but you are always criticized, right? So anyway, I want to first point that out. And then as to the piece of whether, well, first of all, also, he talks about this quote in August of 1844. I think that's when he said it was. I haven't been able to find it. Does anyone know what he's talking about? Where Brigham says that no one is allowed to... He
claims that it won't extend the hand of fellowship to anybody, insinuating that Joseph Smith wasn't right in the sight of God.
Right. And then he goes on to connect it to polygamy. So that acknowledges right there that Brigham Young was openly declaring polygamy in August of 1844. Remember the super duper secret polygamy that there can't be any records of because nobody knows about it, right? And so I would love to see this quote along the lines of Brigham's of Joseph's super duper secret polygamy that, by the way, was not spiritual wifery. Spiritual wifery, John Bennett bad, celestial plural marriage, Joseph Smith good. Yeah. But
even though we can never find a single time of Joseph Smith ever once using the phrase celestial plural marriage.
Exactly. So let me just read to you a little bit of a speech delivered by Brigham Young on April 6th, 1845. And I'll read you and it was printed in the Times and Seasons, July 1st, 1845. So this is absolutely contemporaneous, not a later invention, like so many of the sources about Joseph Smith's super duper secret polygamy. Polygamy could not be spoken in Illinois. It's illegal. Shh, it's quiet. No. So this is Brigham Young. And I'm going to read the first paragraph to set the stage about the super secret doctrine. I hope there may be faith enough in this congregation of saints to still the wind and strengthen my voice so that I may be heard above all this vast assemblage of people. And in order that my voice may extend and be heard by all, it will be necessary for the brethren and sisters to be as quiet as possible. And I will do my best to speak that you may all hear and understand. So is this a super little secret meeting or is this a big old giant meeting, right? And let's go on to read.
Puffing his chest.
Right. So first of all, when we're saying that he would never criticize Joseph Smith, this is actually a really important speech because it's the first time I find what becomes a central doctrine, that Brigham can change everything Joseph did by saying it's line upon line. God only reveals line upon line. And so he gives a big, long sermon, which talking about how Joseph didn't quite get things right. And then he says, Joseph in his lifetime did not receive everything connected with the doctrine of redemption, but he has left the key with those who understand how to obtain and teach to this great people all that is necessary for their salvation and exaltation in the celestial kingdom of our God. So he didn't get things right, but he gave us the keys, which, by the way, my third part on the temples will address. That's a forthcoming episode.
I just want to point out the implications of that right there. Brigham Young is claiming Joseph Smith couldn't teach redemption completely.
Right.
That's what I read into that. It seems like what he's indicating. Yeah. Redemption isn't fully understood through Joseph's teachings.
It becomes completely about keys. Joseph didn't get the information right, but he gave me the keys so I can give you the correct information.
Well, and plus, we read from John Taylor as well as Brigham Young to where polygamy is a requirement for salvation now that Joseph's gone.
Yes. And I would like people to notice I'm reading the exact source, which I have given you exactly where you can find it, unlike Don Bradley just telling us what that journal entry says, right? This is what you have to do in historical work. It's important. Okay, we have got to learn how to be faithful with the few things. You know the promises. If we are faithful in a few things, we shall be made rulers over many things. If we approve upon the small things, greater will be given to us. So there's the first instance I have found of him outright saying Joseph didn't get it right. May I continue to read what he says a little bit later in this vast assemblage, right? I would now call your attention to some of the sayings of the Apostle Paul. I hope you will not stumble at them. Paul says, nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. The same apostle also says, the woman is the glory of the man. Now, brethren, these are Paul's sayings, not Joseph Smith's spiritual wife system sayings.
Tell me what
Did you hear what I just said?
Brigham Young just say.
Brigham Young, because I have a whole episode planned on this as well, on spiritual wifery versus celestial plural marriage, right? I have at least 6 separate instances of Brigham Young himself referring to celestial plural marriage as spiritual wifery. It goes on, I'll read more. And many other people as well, right? So he's saying, so remember, Joseph could never talk about it because it was super secret, and Joseph wasn't doing celestial plural marriage. I mean, Joseph wasn't doing spiritual wifery, except that Brigham right here says Joseph didn't get everything. Oh, but spiritual wifery was from Joseph. And it was called spiritual wifery for him because he didn't know yet that he needed to draw the distinction to separate himself from that part of the narrative hadn't arisen yet, that it was this, not that. That comes later. So, and I would say, as no man can be perfect without the woman, so no woman can be perfect without a man to lead her. I tell you the truth as it is in the bosom of eternity, and I say so to every man upon the face of the earth. If he wishes to be saved, he cannot be saved without a woman by his side. This is spiritual wifism. That is the doctrine of spiritual wives.
Oh my
that
goodness.
Is Brigham. This is another bombshell. This is Brigham Young in 1845 at a huge meeting, right?
Yeah.
Now remember,
Still in Nauvoo.
1845. Where
so much for distinguishing from John C. Bennett.
The entire reason we don't have any records of Joseph Smith is because it was so dangerous. If the people in Illinois knew he was he had spiritual wifery, they'd come and get him. Yet Brigham Young is saying it. So the claim that I have been making, that Whitney has been making, is that what was the limiting factor of spiritual wifism in Nauvoo was Joseph Smith.
Well, even
as soon as he's gone, it's out in the open.
Even if the only thing that we do is go to the church essay, it'll say up until Joseph's death, only 78 individuals had entered into plural relationships, 28 men and 50 women. And then 3 years later, by the time the first Latter-day Saints showed up in Utah, it's 700 plus. What was the big change? Joseph was now out of the way.
Yeah.
Right. So this right here is another one that is huge, that blows the whole thing out of the water. You cannot claim it had to be kept secret. Can't claim that at all. And you can't claim that Brigham Young was doing celestial plural marriage. Only John Bennett did spiritual wifery. This one blows those both away. And I would invite Don or Cardin or Brian Hales or anyone else to combat this, to explain this one away that is actually contemporaneous as opposed to all of their sources. And if we want to put the puzzle pieces together, as Don constantly tells us to, we can look at how the narrative shifts and how the stories they tell at the time are based in the current narrative. But when you have, that's why contemporaneous sources matter so much.
Well, and it's interesting too, because this really could be the very first time Brigham combines Joseph's name with polygamy publicly.
Right. It's the first one I've found.
Yeah.
And what's it called? Let's all say it together. Spiritual wifism, spiritual wifery, right? So the story we have now is the reason we have not a shred of evidence of Joseph's polygamy, despite what Don Bradley says about 30 pieces. I hope we get into some of those too, because I've done the research on those, right? Like the claim is we have no evidence because it was secret. Well, then why is Brigham teaching it to a huge, vast assemblage? And we have the claim that Joseph was only doing celestial plural marriage. Only John Bennett was doing spiritual wifery. This is huge.
Yeah. So one possibility is we don't have it because it's secret. Another possibility is because it didn't happen.
Right. Because during those exact same years, we have tons of evidence from Brigham and Heber. William Clayton, look at his journals, right? Like it doesn't
if they'll release them. So there's one example of Brigham Young being willing to criticize Joseph. But here's another one that you pulled up for me, Michelle. Let's find out if Brigham Young is consistent saying won't tolerate anybody insinuating that Joseph has done anything wrong. March 21st, 1858, from the Tabernacle. I will deviate from my subject a little and say a few words with regard to brother Joseph that some perhaps have not understood. If Joseph Smith Jr., the prophet, had followed the spirit of revelation in him, he would never have gone to Carthage. Do you understand that? Joseph said, I am led like a lamb to the slaughter, and never for one moment did he say that he had one particle of light in him after he started back from Montrose to give himself up in Nauvoo. Thus, he did through the persuasion of others. I want you all to understand that if Joseph had followed the revelations in him, he would have been our earthly shepherd today, and he would have heard his voice and followed the shepherd instead of the shepherds following the sheep. The policy so here's what I'm getting from this. He's claiming if Joseph Smith was hearing the voice of the Lord, he'd still be alive. That's a very specific claim to where Joseph was no longer hearing the voice of God.
It's also useful to understand that this was at a time when Brigham, the federal government was trying to displace Brigham from his position. So he was arguing for himself using Joseph, saying, yes, Joseph allowed himself to be taken, but I have the spirit more than Joseph did, so I'm not going to do that.
I feel like a lot of what Brigham did and said reveals the attitudes of the people at the time, kind of the sentiments or the popular things that were being said, and then he would give these sermons to try and quiet it down. So obviously there were people saying that Joseph had lost his spirit, and that's why he was taken to Carthage. So Brigham's kind of like, yeah, that's true, right? And if he wouldn't have, he would still be our leader today. But then if you read a little further, he makes this statement. Can you bring that back up? Because I find that very fascinating. To me, it reveals a little bit more of Brigham Young's own heart. He says, Joseph's going to Carthage did not save this people. The people would have been just as well off if Joseph had left the country. They succeeded in killing him and thought they could kill me and Brother Kimball and Brother Hyde, on and on and on. So I have found, journals and other things from that time where the people did believe that Joseph had sacrificed his life because the Lord was not pleased with the church. And so to me, why is Brigham having to say, no, his death, it didn't save us? Well, there were people who thought it did. And Brigham, to me, is trying to minimize Joseph here and, make himself the one that the Lord, we're fine. The church is fine. The church is still growing strong. Lord's still with us. And we, still hear that message today. It's there. I was telling Michelle the other day, Jacob, that when I wrote my book, I thought, if I go and present this to the church historian, I figured he wouldn't change his mind, right? But I thought, well, maybe I could convince him to at least just let these documents out without the commentary. Like, get the church historian commentary off, just put out all the documents and let us see them and choose for ourselves. So I made an appointment. Well, I tried to make an appointment, and his secretary told me he was busy for the unforeseeable future and could not meet with me, but referred me to a female historian because this was a women's issue, a woman's issue.
I was going to say that it's because you're just a girl, Whitney. Just a girl.
I wish I had the kind of job where I just might not be available for the unforeseeable future and that standard procedure.
And it's really actually quite hurtful and harmful to the women of the church when a show like Ward Radio, that's all men interviewing a man, puts everything that Michelle and I have done and boils it down to, they just didn't like polygamy. Mm-hmm. Oh, you poor little sisters that just, I would get down there in Relief Society. Oh, you sister that just lacks faith. When you have more faith, you'll understand polygamy. I mean, it's really hurtful and harmful, and it's just bad form to boil all of this down to of course we don't like it.
At least now it's just LDS apologist beta males that are insinuating you must not like it, rather than the leaders of the church continuing to call you nosy little snoops from the pulpit.
You whiny little women. You whiny little women. Stop your whining.
Well, it is also, I mean, Whitney, I'm so glad you pulled it out. It is massively sexist to demean us to the point of neglecting all of the intensive research that we have done, all of the pile of evidence we are bringing forward by just telling us it's wishful thinking, by just saying that it's motivated reasoning. It is exactly the opposite. And they owe it to, like, if they don't want to be massively sexist, they need to take us seriously and engage with us.
I want to put a plug, a compliment for the kind of overkill research that people can expect from your productions. I remember the episode responding to Mormon stories saying that, there's no children from Joseph Smith because they actually understood birth control, modern birth control, a lot better than we give them credit for. And when I listened to that episode, it's like, holy crap, coming with the receipts and all of the known information. So in other words, it cannot be ignored that Whitney Horning and Michelle Stone, they come with the receipts when they opine on a topic.
Yeah. And Michelle especially, I want to give kudos to her. Her research, she's just amazing, the amount of time and effort she puts into her shows.
So let's take a listen to what Don Bradley has to say regarding contemporary sources and the reasons why we don't have so many of them. But he does make a claim on the amount of contemporary sources that we have. What do we have, Don?
Polygamy, that he would have had to have been trying to keep it secret, right? He's publicly denying it and so on. So if you're trying to keep a practice secret, you're not documenting it well.
So I just have to say, he's claiming you're not documenting it if you're trying to keep it secret. You're also not documenting it if you're not doing that. And for some reason, that's not a possibility to Don Bradley.
He just mentioned it's illegal in Illinois, and yet we just read Brigham's speech. The secret polygamy excuse for no documentation is so weak. It's got to be done.
Right? Like, that's the idea. You don't have a reason to be documenting it. It's at this time, it's illegal under Illinois law. You don't want to create documents that are going to leave a paper trail for prosecution or something, right? Yeah. If you're trying to keep it secret, you're trying to keep it secret. That means you're not documenting it. And yet, we end up with, about, by my count, I've collected together, along with another friend, about 30 sources.
Okay, I just have to point this out. 30 contemporary sources, and now he's going to lead with what he believes is the strongest contemporary source. Keep going, Don.
On Joseph Smith teaching and practicing polygamy from during his lifetime.
Wow.
From during his lifetime. Okay.
Because that is actually something I've heard multiple times, that there are no contemporary accounts.
No. They're like 30. Okay.
They're like 30. Hit us with the best one, Don.
And what I was supposed to say earlier, what I was wanting to say was that we have Joseph Smith's, again, his own record in the scriptures recorded from a letter and from a revelation saying the importance of record keeping. That the way that we seal on earth and seal in heaven is by creating records. And that if a record is not made, something is not sealed. So the idea that they were trying to keep it secret, so he didn't create records, when he talked a lot about the importance of records, and in every other thing, they kept very careful records.
Am I getting this? That still the strongest contemporary evidence are the accusers of the Nauvoo expositor. Does he? I don't think he gives anything more than that, because when I had my discussion with Jason on Thoughtful Saints regarding this, they're the closest they can come up with credible sources are the traitors trying to get a mob to kill Joseph. And that's it.
John Bennett, Joseph Jackson, William Law, Austin Cowles, add to it from this interview, Oliver Olney, which, by the way, please watch Whitney and my conversation on this, because we go into depth in a lot of these sources. It is delightful what you uncover when you actually dig into these sources. But yes, doesn't the Doctrine and Covenants say something about the testimonies of traitors? Isn't that what we're not supposed to listen to? Every contemporaneous source is an accuser of Joseph Smith who wants him dead.
Whitney.
Well, I love that. Jacob, didn't you call in during one of these episodes and read that scripture?
Yes, I'm going to pull that up right now.
And I'm thinking of the promise in section 122 of the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah.
Speaking to Joseph Smith, your people will never be turned from you by the testimony of traitors. So, Don Bradley, I'd love your opinion. When people are relying upon details from the Nauvoo expositor and the accusers in the Nauvoo expositor, do you consider those credible accusations against Joseph Smith, or is that part of the testimony of traitors talked about in Doctrine and Covenants section 122?
So, interesting, right?
Thank you, Jacob Isbell.
Yeah. So you've got a framing, right, added to the question. So first, there's the question itself, and then there's a frame that's added to the question as part of a persuasive appeal, right?
So do you believe the traitors or not? Come on, answer his question, Doug.
Showed that clip right there where he just says it's framing and doesn't answer anything.
Well, because what he does do when he answers you is that he exposes what historians today do, and that is that they believe everyone. So everyone was telling the truth. And so therefore, if Joseph said he wasn't doing it, well, then he has to be, because everyone tells the truth. So then they've turned it into, well, it was super secret. He was lying for the Lord, X, Y, Z. But really at the heart of it, someone was lying. Someone was lying. Joseph Smith was lying, or all of these other people, starting with Brigham Young, were lying. And we're left to make a choice. And the DNC does tell us that Joseph would be harmed by the testimony of traitors, and that we today, that Joseph's people, those who the Lord would consider Joseph's people, will be those who do not believe the testimony of traitors. So when you called in and said that, I was just like, yes, Jacob, good job.
Well, Quaku and I are homies. We go hit the gym. We've been able to hit the gym together, him and I. So let's go into this one. Don Bradley makes some claims regarding clunky things that are in the scriptures. It really starts to indicate the level of value that he places on the scriptures as being authoritative.
Jacob, while you're getting that, can I just say one thing that you might want to add to that last conversation? Because it's a point I brought up with Whitney. My other question regarding testimonies of traitors, Brian Hales has this category of polygamy insiders and polygamy outsiders, the special ones in the know and everybody else. So my question is, these traitors, are they polygamy insiders or polygamy outsiders? Because if they are polygamy insiders, why don't they also have plural wives? Joseph was trying to get everyone else to do it with him, right? Evil loves company. And so if they were the polygamy insiders, why did they want to kill Joseph? And why was their knowledge so limited and cryptic and strange and not complete? Whereas Brigham knew everything Joseph had ever said because he was a polygamy insider. If they were polygamy outsiders, then how did they know who his wives were when nobody else knew? Why should we listen to their lists? I think that's an important question for the church historians to answer for us.
So D&C 132 can easily be held up to a different standard than other scriptures because, in fact, there are things in the Book of Mormon where it says like clunky things. There are things where it teaches things that modern Latter-day Saints don't necessarily believe about. In Alma, there's a place where he does this.
When he says things that are clunky, he's saying things that Latter-day Saints don't necessarily believe. Like I give less than half a damn. I can't even think of how small of a fraction of a damn that I give what other people think about the scriptures. I place high value upon them, and I don't really care if others believe it. Now, who does he say in Alma puts clunky things? I'm just going back a couple of seconds.
Than other scriptures, because in fact, there are things in the Book of Mormon where it says like clunky things. There are things where it teaches things that modern Latter-day Saints don't necessarily believe about. In Alma, there's a place where he does this in Alma 42 about the resurrection. There's doctrine that there are only two paths. There's just like heaven or hell, and this hell is eternal and so on. And that the impression that's given there is something that modern Latter-day Saints don't actually believe. And
I don't know why. Now, any thoughts on that? Where I don't care what modern Latter-day Saints believe. If they don't believe the scriptures, that's on them. Let me know what you think. What he's trying to get at there, saying that because he claims that Latter-day Saints don't believe what's in the Book of Mormon, we should be comfortable holding Section 132 to a lower standard. I think that's just an indictment of the Latter-day Saints he's given, pointing out that Latter-day Saints don't believe their scriptures. Any thoughts on that?
I agree 100% with what you're saying, Jacob. When I heard him say this, when I heard Don say this, my immediate thought was, well, then the Latter-day Saints need to go and figure out and understand what the Book of Mormon's teaching. I mean, just because we don't understand it doesn't mean it's not true. It means there's something we need to go figure out. There's something we need to take to the Lord. There's something we need to go investigate more fully until we can understand it. To me, I thought that's just a ridiculous way to say it's okay. We have 132 that no one understands because, quite frankly, it's a horrible document. And that's okay because we don't understand other things. Well, let's understand them. Like, let's figure them out and let's go learn what they mean.
I'm a big fan.
What I find troubling is the desire and willingness to demean what Joseph Smith himself called the most correct of any book in order to validate 132. We all know 132 is bad. And instead of acknowledging that, we're trying to claim that the Book of Mormon is also bad. Whatever people may or may not understand in the Book of Mormon, it does not compare to 132.
Well, in only one interview, Don Bradley downgrades what it means to be a prophet to fit his narrative. Now he's downgrading the Book of Mormon to fit his Doctrine and Covenants section 132 narrative. In other words, what I do, I know that this is going to come across as me just hammering, and I don't care. But it's like, don't you believe in a God of power and of truth, of eternal truth, where he's the same yesterday, today, and forever? And when I see just these spiritually weak men who are in one voice trying to say, well, we're just looking at the historical record, and then the next sentence over, well, I'm going to give claims about what it's like in the eternities. It's just like, doesn't value the scriptures, doesn't recognize a different God is speaking in section 132 than in the Book of Mormon. It's like there's some serious soul searching that has to be done. That is not consistent. That's not the God that we know from the scriptures.
And it unfortunately really shows us what people's ultimate sacred cow is, because they will destroy everything and demean everything, demean the Book of Mormon, demean prophets, demean Joseph Smith, demean all of our history, demean everything in order to hold up this golden idol of Section 132. I don't understand the commitment to it.
Well, here
they'll burn everything in its wake.
Michelle and I get accused constantly of having a bias, right? And especially in this episode, Dawn accuses me of having a bias, right? And the whole episode, you can hear all of their biases. Their bias is the sacred cow of the LDS Church does nothing wrong.
I have done nothing wrong ever in my life.
I know this. And I love you.
I love you too, Daddy. Money, please! My money.
And people who head down this path of wanting to know the truth about Joseph Smith, the truth about polygamy, the truth about 132, well, and I think it's okay for them to be concerned that they see people heading into a path that they don't feel comfortable with. But you don't have to head down that path. Like Michelle pointed out earlier, in my life, all of the people I know who headed down the path of leaving the church and leaving God were ones on the path that Joseph did do polygamy. So I guess I just don't quite, maybe I just don't interact with the people that they're interacting with. But for me, part of writing my book was wanting to help those people who had left God and had left the restoration and had left the Book of Mormon come back to it.
Another thing I find really interesting is that they're only concerned about deception in one direction. The one commandment that Jesus gives us in the Book of Mormon is to read Isaiah. And when I read Isaiah, just like when I read the Book of Mormon, I am constantly smacked in the face by similar messages, which is don't put your trust in the arm of flesh. Don't look to the institution to save you, right? Those messages come through loud and clear and repeatedly. And so for them to assume that if we're blind and in our little box and not seeking, not learning discernment, not grappling with the hard questions, like wasn't it Jacob that wrestled with the angel? Mm-hmm. Isn't that the model? They always talk about Jacob being the model in polygamy. I'd say let's have Jacob be the model in the wrestle. We are supposed to be grappling to find truth, and being deceived is bad no matter where it happens. And so if we are deceived by these false doctrines of polygamy and false teachings, false traditions, to the point that we will burn down the Book of Mormon, burn down the character of prophets, burn down the nature of God and God's connection and care for his children. If we will do that for the sake of polygamy, we are so badly deceived that we've got to be saved. The Book of Mormon itself and the Doctrine and Covenants tell us that we are under condemnation, tell us that we are condemned for not receiving more. And it is when we dare to step into truth and repentance, repenting of these false ideas, that we begin to receive more and more and more. And so I don't know why they only care about one form of deception. I think every form of deception is wrong, and the Book of Mormon repeatedly tells us how to avoid it. It's not by staying in the middle of the good ship Zion. It's by learning discernment and learning to follow the Spirit.
Nephi warns us that we can be lulled into a false sense of carnal security. Like the idea that nothing's supposed to be difficult, or that we're not supposed to grapple with things, or wrestle with God to obtain a blessing or obtain an answer. I mean, we can figure out the things that Don Bradley feels are clunky in the Book of Mormon. Those are things those should be taking us onto our knees and taking us to God and taking us to researching more and understanding more. I mean, they shouldn't be things that we just go, oh, well, we'll just go put that over in this corner and stay away from it because it's scary or it's, confusing. Yeah. Like I'm having in my mind with our discussion today, this idea of, how you can get a ball of yarn and it's all in this big, huge knot. And that's what polygamy is. Like the way the LDS Church explains it, like it's a big, huge knotted mess, but we really can unpick it, and we can get those knots out and we can straighten it out.
Turn it from a house of confusion to a house of order.
Yes. Yep, exactly.
Now, you did bring up regarding wrestling, Michelle, and it's interesting because I'm working with Quaker right now to get Jacob Isbell to wrestle Jacob Hansen. We're going to turn it into a full event.
Oh, nice.
That'll be fun to watch.
That'll be a fun one. It's
front row seats.
What's that?
Front row seats.
We're going to get it to happen. That'll be a fun one. Now,
Who's going to be the girls' round?
I'm going to go to where the part where Don Bradley brings up Whitney quite specifically. 44 minutes and 15 seconds.
You can mention my name for some reason. I'm not as dangerous as Michelle. She can't be named.
It's that Michelle. She lives in the dangerous part of town. She'll shank you. Let's go over here.
So one of the big proponents of skepticism that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, Whitney Horning, has written a book about Joseph Smith and polygamy. In the introduction, Whitney talks about, I forget the exact wording, but she says that she has kind of made up her mind up front that she is going to believe Joseph Smith's public denials of having practiced polygamy, that like polygamy seems to her plainly a bad thing, right? And that in this book, she is going to look at things through that lens.
Okay, so let me just stop that right there and throw this over to you. Do you start off in your introduction saying, I've already concluded Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist, so here's my book through that lens?
No, not at all. I appreciated Don saying this because I haven't read my preface for quite a while. And so I went back and reread it today. And I used to be actually a little bit uncomfortable because I felt like I was pretty vulnerable with that. And I wished that I hadn't included it in the book. I have a family member who was pretty upset. They got the book and read the preface and threw the book away and called me pretty upset about it. And I was like, wow. So, my family member was upset. Don Bradley's claiming this stuff. So I went back and reread it, and I don't at all. In fact, I talk about how I spent most of my life as a Mormon apologist, and that I finally decided I needed to grapple with this issue of whether or not it really was for me. Like I said, at the beginning was God, the originator of this practice. And then I decided that I couldn't deny the spirit I felt with the works of Joseph Smith, because I kind of went through a period of thinking Joseph was a fallen prophet. I came to the conclusion it's not of God. The church says Joseph did it. They have all this evidence that they claim says Joseph did it. If Joseph did it, then he must have been a fallen prophet because it is not of God. So then I went through and and in the preface, I talk about that I labored to find and compare historical data to God's word, and then to find and compare that historical data to Joseph. And what happened was I went through a period of real cognitive dissonance, and it was actually a really painful journey because I just kept finding all this evidence that Joseph said he didn't do it, that Joseph was condemning it, that Joseph was denouncing it, that Joseph was excommunicating people for practicing it. And so I went through this period of time of feeling like he really became kind of a scoundrel. And what do I do with that? And so for me, I was actually coming to a conclusion that most people do who cannot cope with and they can't accept Joseph being that kind of a person. And so they leave the church and they leave God a lot of times. I actually was headed in that direction. And I don't know why God was so merciful to me to open my eyes. And it was just a very simple little whisper. I don't even talk about this in the book at all, but it was a whisper. Something had been happening in my own life where my husband and I had been falsely accused of doing something. It was just something silly, not a really big deal, but still something that bothered us, that somebody had accused us of doing something that we hadn't done, like, just at church, like that we hadn't, that I think he'd released a woman from a calling and she had asked for it and then was lying and telling everybody what a horrible bishop he was, because whatever. So just something silly, right? But it still had some consequences and some pain. Nothing compared to being lied about in this matter. But God used that. And all he said to me was, don't you wish people believed you? And I was like, yeah. Can you not believe Joseph? You believe the scriptures mean what they say. Can you believe Joseph meant what he said? So, for somebody to sum it all up and to try and scare people away from reading my book by just saying, oh, she just said, I'm going to believe Joseph. Oh, easy. Can I write a book about it? I mean, it just takes away the years of struggle, the years of pain trying to figure this out. And then, no, I don't say, oh, I just decided to believe Joseph. I'm very upfront with the fact that I was an LDS apologist for most of my life. I had to overcome that because it does make you then have to grapple with, what does that mean about my church? What does that mean about it? It does make you. So when these guys and Don are trying to say, hey, if you put it on Brigham, then what does that mean about Brigham? And what does that mean? Yes, that is true. And it can be difficult and it can be painful. I want to recommend that if your testimony is built on those things and not on Jesus Christ and not on the scriptures, it will be very difficult for you. But if you can first get yourself strong on the Lord and built strong on him and built strong on his scriptures, when you're at that point, then is the time to go start dealing with these things.
Okay. I love those thoughts right there. You know what? Let me ask this. We're going to put the landing gear down right now, and I'm going to put in a big plug to listen to Michelle and Whitney in their upcoming episode where they discuss this in even greater depth. Is there any sort of invitation or challenge that you would have to further this discussion? Because I actually find the disagreements beneficial, even though it's kind of annoying. Mm-hmm. Some of the claims that are just easily thrashed. I do appreciate the fact that it's out there, that it's published, that it can be responded to. Any invitations or challenges?
I absolutely agree. I think that the discussion, I'm a big believer of public discourse, of the contest of ideas. I so appreciate that Don did these interviews because every source that he brought up, I was able to go, oh, that's a new one. I hadn't heard of the Oliver Olney source, which was a really fun investigation to do that Whitney and I talk about. The Franklin Richards source that he mentioned. So every time we continue to engage, we move this further. I am thrilled that Don has agreed to come and talk to me. I'm really excited for that. I was really happy that Cardin had me on his podcast the first time. I wish I hadn't got on the second time, but the first time. And I would welcome any discussion. And I do prefer discussion over debate because I don't think that we move things forward as far when we're trying to win. I think it's better when we're trying to share and collaborate and say, hey, I have this source. What do you think of that? I have this source. What do you think of that? And when we allow each other to do that I think a debate, the goal is to prove you're right. I think a discussion, hopefully the goal is to discover truth, right? And to make sure that we're all headed on the right path. That's what I like better. I will do debate if that's the best we can do. But I do hope that there will continue to be further engagement. I've been disappointed that Cardin hasn't had me back on. I've offered a couple of times, and I think that they're either scared away or trying to preserve a narrative. And that makes me sad because that's not what they claim to be doing. I've been in contact with Mormon Stories, and I've offered to go on and talk to them. I feel it's this same. They're claiming to be angry at the church for pushing a narrative over the truth. Well, I would ask them, what are they doing? So, and then I tried really hard on behalf of Whitney and some other people to set something up with Bill Reel and RFM. That crashed and burned badly because people weren't willing to just have a conversation. And so anyway, but even that, I would go on in a heartbeat. I will have a conversation anytime, any place, because even if there's a source I don't know, that's actually great because I can go research more and learn more. So anyone who is willing to have a discussion, let's do it, please.
Thank you so much. Any final thoughts, Whitney?
No, just amen to everything. Thank you so much, Jacob, for having us on. I appreciate. Yep. Where'd mine go? I got to go open mine afterwards.
Last plug right now for the sponsor of today's episode, Brigham's Brew. He brewed up something all right, and
he sure did. And Michelle, I love how Michelle puts it. She says, let's put the crime on the correct perpetrator.
Yeah,
and that's what we're trying to do. And yes, it's going to be difficult for you maybe to work through some things, the people listening, right? It might make you question some things. For me, it kind of shook up my whole entire foundation. Yeah. But I just want to say God is there. God wants to help us find truth. We're always better off when we have truth. Always.
Agreed. I'd say the truth, no matter what. That's been my
truth will set you free.
See,
and it's interesting because I didn't realize God was actually moving me into this direction while for a couple of years, I just would have this going through my head constantly. The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free. And I would think, well, okay, well, I'm going to church. I'm reading my scriptures. And so really, it does. It sets you free. I was so excited when I figured this out. That's why I wrote a book, because I wanted to free other people from the chains that have bound us down. You know, in Michelle's episode on the temple, she talks about, I don't know if I haven't got to the end of this one yet, so I don't know if you do, but she's going to talk about how the manifesto is repentance. Well, it started, and then they just can't let go of polygamy. Like, let's break those chains, be completely free of it, finish our repentance, and really rise up to be the people God would like us to be.
Okay.
Whitney, and I know we're winding up.
Please.
One last really quick point. I'm sorry, but
you're good.
While for people who do feel afraid, right, who feel afraid of investigating this and feel like it's going to shake things up, I just want to consider, why is it harder if Brigham Young did something wrong than it is if Joseph Smith did something wrong? Yeah. I don't understand why that's a harder question, because Joseph Smith is the conduit through which we get the Book of Mormon and the Restoration and the Doctrine and Covenants and the things we hold most sacred and most dear. So I don't know why that's a harder thing to consider. Why are we throwing Joseph Smith under the bus to try to save something about Brigham Young when we already know that there were lots of problems with Brigham Young? And beyond that, why is that better than throwing God under the bus, right? Like, those are the steps. You have to have a problem with either Brigham Young or Joseph Smith or God. Someone got it wrong. And I would suggest that the evidence strongly points to the third on that list. But in any case, don't be afraid of truth. God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Seek, be open, desire truth, be willing to engage, be willing to investigate. It's worth it.
Okay. Thank you so much. Whitney Horning, Michelle Stone, it's always a pleasure, even if it's in digital format. At some point, we'll meet in person, cook some meat together, and have Brigham brews one with another. Have a great week.
Thank you so much, Jacob. It's been wonderful. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.